In a small room in Massachusetts, 24 boys sat down with 3 men, and a school opened for the first time. What that school later wrote about itself is the reason you are here. It did not open to teach those boys. It opened to work on them because of who their fathers were. Today, you are going to see the asset old money actually passes down and why it is almost never money. The year was 1884. The man at the front of the room was 27 years old. He would stay at that desk for 56 years. And more than a century later, the school describes its own founding purpose in writing, in public, on its own pages. It says it was created to instill high-minded principles in the offspring of the most successful American entrepreneurs of the Gilded Age. Read that slowly. Not the sons of the aristocracy, the offspring of entrepreneurs. New men, new fortunes. Men who had made their money in a single lifetime and had nowhere to put their children. The school was not built to educate the old families. It was built to finish the new ones. That is the machine. And once you can see it running in 1884, you will start seeing it everywhere else, including in places that publish their own numbers and do not think of themselves as Gates at all. Quick ask before we go further. If you want to understand how lasting wealth actually moves, subscribe now. It helps this channel more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this world to show you. Now, consider what a self-made fortune actually looks like from the inside, at the moment it is complete. A man has built something, the money is real, the house is bought, the name is on a building somewhere, and then he looks at his son, and he understands a problem that money cannot solve on its own. His son will inherit everything he owns and none of what he knows. Worse, his son will inherit a surname that the people who matter do not yet recognize. There is no market for that. You cannot buy your way into being recognized because recognition is precisely the thing that is withheld from people who arrive with a checkbook. The harder you push with money, the more clearly you announce that money is all you have. So the problem gets solved a different way. It gets solved with time and with children. This is what the school in Massachusetts was for. Not chemistry, not Latin, though there was Latin. It existed so that a boy whose father had made his money in one lifetime could spend the whole of his adolescence sleeping, eating, praying, rowing, and arguing beside boys whose families had held money for 3 or 4 generations. That is long enough that the distinction stops being visible. By the end, nobody in that room can tell you who arrived with a name and who arrived with a fortune. And the length of it is what makes it work. Not a summer, not a season of introductions arranged by a hopeful parent. Years of ordinary weekday mornings, of being tired together, of small humiliations and small victories witnessed by the same faces. Nobody performs for that long. Whatever a boy actually is, that much time will surface it, and the other boys will have seen it, and they will still be there. That is the conversion. Money in, standing out. And the receipt is not a diploma. The receipt is that those boys will know each other for the rest of their lives. Understand what the father actually bought. He did not buy an education, which he could have hired at home for less. He bought his son a set of relationships that the son could never have assembled on his own, at an age when relationships form without effort and last without maintenance. And here is the part that matters for everything that follows. Those relationships do not stop at the son. The son will propose his own children. The families his son grew up beside will do the same. What began as one man's problem becomes, within 2 generations, a standing arrangement between families who no longer remember which of them was new. Consider how strange that is as a form of property. Every other asset that father owned could be counted, and because it could be counted, it could be taken. A business can fail, a house can burn, or be mortgaged, or be sold in a bad year by an heir who needed cash. Cash itself can be divided among 4 children until none of them has enough to matter. Every visible asset in that man's estate had a number attached to it, and every number was a handle that someone else could grab. The relationships had no number, and so there was no handle. The man at the front of that room stayed for 56 years. Think about what 56 years means in a place like that. It means he did not simply run a school. He personally watched boys arrive, and then, decades later, watched their sons arrive. He was the continuity. He was the living memory that told one generation what the last one had been like. That is not an educator. That is an institution keeping a ledger that has no numbers in it. And a ledger with no numbers is very difficult to tax, very difficult to divide, and completely impossible to seize. Which raises the obvious question. If this thing has no numbers, how does anyone keep track of it? How does a world that runs on lists keep a list of something that is deliberately unwritten? It turns out that somebody did write it down, and what he used to build it was the least glamorous object in the house. In 1886, a man in New York named Lewis Keller had an idea that sounds almost too plain to be the foundation of an aristocracy. He noticed that prominent families all kept the same domestic object, a visiting list, names and addresses of the people they called on socially, written out alphabetically. Every household of any standing had one. Each list was private, partial, and slightly different from every other list. Keller's idea was to consolidate them. That is it. That is the origin of the register that would define American society for a century. Not a charter, not a bloodline, not a coat of arms. Somebody gathered up everyone's address books and merged them into one. The association says so itself in its own account of its history. The origins are found in 19th century visiting lists, names and addresses of the social contacts of prominent families, alphabetically arranged. And when he assembled that compilation, it was composed primarily of descendants of the early Dutch and English settlers of his city. Sit with what that means, because it is the whole mechanism in one sentence. The criterion was not achievement. It was not wealth exactly. It was descent from people who had arrived early. The register did not measure what you had done. It measured how long your family had been in the room. And it worked. It worked so thoroughly that by 1918, there were 18 annual volumes covering 26 cities. A private address book had become a national infrastructure of recognition in a country that had built its founding story on the idea that it had no aristocracy at all. Today, that same association still publishes. The winter edition comes out every November, and it carries almost 25,000 entries. And it still arrives the same way it always has. Not as a feed that updates itself, not as a database you can query at 2 in the morning. A volume, printed, once a year, in the same month, the way it has been done since before the automobile was common. That rhythm is worth noticing, because everything else about how people track each other has been rebuilt 3 times over in the same period. The register did not modernize, and the reason is that modernizing would destroy the product. A list that updates instantly is a list that can be gamed instantly. A list that appears once a year, on paper, moves at the speed of the thing it is actually measuring, which is not success. It is standing, and standing takes years to change. 25,000 in a nation of hundreds of millions. That number has not exploded with the economy, and that is the point. The list is not tracking prosperity, it is tracking something that does not scale. Now think about what a list like this actually does, because it is easy to mistake it for vanity. It is not vanity. A published list solves a genuine and difficult problem. The problem is verification. In a small town, everyone knows who your grandfather was. In a country of continental size, with new fortunes appearing every year in cities nobody has visited, that knowledge collapses. A man from Cleveland cannot possibly know whether a family from Baltimore is what it claims to be. So the list answers the question before it is asked. It is a directory of people who have already been checked by someone else. That is its function. It converts a private and unreliable thing, which is reputation, into a portable one that travels between cities and survives the death of the people who originally vouched for you. And notice what it never has to do. It never has to say no in public. There is no rejection letter. There is no explanation. There is simply a book, and your family is in it or your family is not, and no one is ever obliged to tell you which criterion you failed. That silence is not an accident, and it is not cruelty for its own sake. It is the most efficient defense a closed group has ever invented. A gate that gives reasons can be argued with. A gate that gives no reasons cannot. Which brings us to the room where that silence is actually manufactured. Because a printed list is only the record. Somewhere, someone has to make the decision that the list reports. And the way that decision gets made is stranger, older, and far more revealing than the book it produces. Picture a room in a private club. There is a book on a table near the entrance, and in that book are the names of people who would like to join. A name does not appear in that book by itself. Someone already inside has to write it there. That person is called the proposer. And a proposer alone is not enough. A second member has to add their name beneath the first, and that person is called the seconder. Before anyone has voted, before anyone has even looked at the candidate, two people who are already inside have permanently attached their own reputations to a name. That is the first filter, and it is the most powerful one, because it operates before the process formally begins. If nobody will write your name, there is no application to reject. Nothing has happened. There is no record of your attempt, because your attempt never became an event. Then comes the vote. And the vote is where the thing becomes almost theatrical in its honesty. Members are given a supply of balls, white and black. Each member takes one and places it, secretly, into a ballot box. The voting is strictly anonymous. White approves, black rejects. Then the box is opened and the balls are counted. And in some very exclusive establishments, a single black ball would be enough to deny membership. 1. Out of a room full of members, one anonymous objection, with no name attached and no reason given, and the candidate does not enter. That is where the word blackballed comes from. It is not a metaphor that drifted into the language from somewhere vague. It is a description of an object in a box on a table. Now hold that mechanism up against the thing most people believe about advancement, which is that you succeed by being good enough. An examination is a test you can pass. It has a syllabus. It has a threshold. If you score high enough, the institution is obliged to take you, and if it does not, you have grounds to complain. A ballot is not a test. There is no score. There is no threshold you can reach through effort, because the standard is not a level of performance. It is the unanimous comfort of the people already inside. Your excellence is irrelevant if one person, for a reason they never have to state, prefers that you are not there. This is the difference that decides everything about who inherits access and who does not. Merit systems are open by design and can be defeated by preparation. Consent systems are closed by design and cannot be defeated at all because there is nothing to prepare for. You cannot study for a black ball. And now notice the position of the child from the family that is already inside. That child does not need to be exceptional. That child needs a proposer, and the proposer is at the dinner table. That child needs a seconder, and the seconder is a family friend of 30 years. The two hardest steps in the entire process, the two steps that stop everyone else before they start, were completed for that child before they were old enough to know the process existed. Everyone else has to be extraordinary and lucky. That child has to be present. And there is a second effect, quieter than the first, that shapes how these people behave for the rest of their lives. If your name goes in that book because two members wrote it there, then those two members are carrying you. Their standing is attached to your conduct now. If you embarrass yourself, you embarrass them, and everyone in the room knows exactly whose judgment failed. So the discipline you have heard described as old money restraint is not entirely a matter of taste. Some of it is structural. When your position rests on people who vouched for you rather than on a score you earned, you become permanently careful because there is no appeal to a transcript. There is only the ongoing willingness of other people to keep having written your name down. That is what makes the arrangement hold across generations without anyone enforcing it. Nobody has to police the rules. Everyone inside is already carrying somebody and being carried by somebody else. Which invites the obvious objection, and it is a fair one. Fine, you might say. Private clubs are private. Let them keep their books and their little boxes. The real gates in modern life are not clubs. They are universities, and universities are ruthlessly meritocratic. They publish their standards. They test you. That objection sounds correct. It is also the exact point where the most careful research on the subject finds something that most people are not prepared for. In 2023, 3 economists set out to answer a question that had been argued about for a century with almost no hard data behind it. Raj Chetty, David Deming, and John Friedman wanted to know what actually determines admission to the most selective private colleges in America and what that admission actually does to a life afterward. Their paper carries a title that sounds mild and is not: Diversifying Society's Leaders. It has since been published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Here's what they found, and I want you to hold on to the exact condition because the condition is the entire finding. Take 2 applicants with comparable standardized test scores, same numbers. One comes from a family in the top 1% of the income distribution. One comes from a middle-class family. The child from the top 1% is twice as likely to attend one of these colleges. Twice, at the same score. Now, the reflex when people hear that is to assume the rich child simply performed better somewhere else in the file. Better essays, better teachers, more polish. But the researchers did not stop at the outcome. They opened the machine and named the parts. They identified 3 mechanisms. The first is preferences for children of alumni. Read that against everything you have heard in the last 20 minutes. What is an alumni preference structurally? It is a proposer. It is a member of the club writing your name in the book before the process starts. The mechanism has not changed since the ballot box. It has only been renamed and moved into an institution that describes itself as meritocratic. The second mechanism is the weight placed on non-academic ratings, and the researchers are specific about where those higher ratings come from. They tend to be higher for students applying from private high schools that have affluent student bodies. Sit with that for a moment because it is the most important sentence in this entire video. The advantage is not in the test. The test is the part that was held equal. The advantage lives in the portion of the file that no examination measures, and that portion travels with the school, which means the years we talked about are not only producing friendships, they are producing a document. The school does not simply place a boy among the right boys. It becomes the institution that vouches for him in writing, to the next gate, in language the next gate already trusts. The third mechanism is the recruitment of athletes, who, the researchers note, tend to come from higher income families. Think about which sports that implies. Not the ones you can play on any public field with borrowed equipment. The ones that require a facility, a coach, a season, and years of somebody driving you there. 3 mechanisms. And notice that not one of them is a conspiracy. Every single one is a published, defensible, ordinary policy that any admissions office will explain to you politely if you ask. Alumni matter to us. We read the whole applicant. We field teams. That is what makes this so much more durable than a secret would be. A secret can be exposed. A policy has a rationale, a constituency, and a comment period. And the researchers put a second number on it that is, in some ways, even more striking than the first. Of the total gap between those 2 children, 2/3 comes from the higher admission rates at comparable scores. The remaining third comes from differences in who applies at all and who enrolls once admitted, which tells you that 1/3 of the gate is not even a gate. It is the fact that some children never approach the door because nobody in their world ever told them the door was for people like them. So the advantage is real, and it is measured, and it is larger than most people would guess. But an advantage in getting in is only interesting if getting in is worth something. The same researchers measured that too, and the size of what they found is the reason this is not a story about school at all. The second half of that research asks the question that actually matters, not who gets in, but what changes in a life because of it. To answer it honestly, you cannot simply compare graduates of elite colleges to everyone else, because the people who get into those colleges were already different. That comparison would tell you nothing except that advantaged people end up advantaged. So the comparison is narrower and far more useful. What happens to a student who attends one of these colleges instead of a strong flagship public university? Similar student, different door. Attending changes the chance of reaching the top 1% of the earnings distribution by 60%. It nearly doubles the chance of attending an elite graduate school, and it roughly triples the chance of working at a prestigious firm. Those 3 numbers describe 3 different things, and the difference between them is where the real lesson sits. Look at the smallest of the 3, and notice that it is the one about money. 60% is an enormous effect by any standard of social science, but it is the smallest number on that list. The largest effect, by a wide margin, is the one about which firm employs you. That is not an earnings effect. That is an access effect. It is a statement about which rooms you are invited into, which colleagues you acquire, and whose phone number you end up with. And the middle number, the elite graduate school, is the most revealing of the three, because a graduate school is not an outcome at all. It is another gate. What the doubling actually describes is that passing through one gate makes the next gate easier. The gates are wired together. That is the shape of the whole thing. This is not a system that hands you a prize. It is a system that hands you a position in a sequence, and the position keeps paying out at every subsequent step, for decades, in ways that never appear on a payslip. Now, let us be careful and honest here, because this is where an argument like this usually overreaches. None of this says that the education is worthless, or that the people inside did not work. Many of them worked ferociously. The finding is not that effort is a fiction. The finding is narrower and stranger. It is that at equal measured ability, the door opens differently, and the difference is produced by parts of the file that no amount of studying can reach. You cannot study your way into being the child of an alumnus. You cannot practice your way into a non-academic rating that is elevated because of the high school your parents could afford. The two largest levers in the machine are, by construction, not available to effort. There is also a quieter reading of the third of the gap that comes from who applies and who enrolls. That third is the only part of the machine that is not defended by anyone. Nobody is protecting it. It persists purely because information about what is possible does not travel evenly, and because a child raised at a distance from these institutions has no one in the house who can say, casually, over dinner, that this is a normal thing for a person like you to attempt. That absence is not a policy. It is a silence, and silences are the cheapest thing in the world to break. And here is what I want you to take from this personally, because there is something usable in it. If you have ever assumed that the gap between you and someone further along was a gap in capability, this research is permission to stop assuming that. At equal measured ability, the outcomes still diverge, and they diverge through named, published mechanisms. That is not a comfort. It is better than a comfort. It is information. Because once you know that the advantage was never really the schooling, you stop trying to buy the schooling, and you start asking what the schooling was actually delivering. It was delivering people, and in the last few years, something happened that let us measure exactly what people are worth, on a scale nobody in 1884 could have imagined. One more thing before the most surprising part of this. If you have stayed with me this far, you already understand more about how Access really works than most people ever will. Subscribing takes a second, and make sure the next one finds you. Now, for most of the last century, the claim that your network determines your prospects was folk wisdom. Everybody said it. Nobody could prove it because you cannot run an experiment on a society. Then, a professional network with hundreds of millions of members did something that had never been possible before. Over a period of 5 years, LinkedIn ran 7 variations of the algorithm that suggests people you may know across the networks of more than 20 million users. In that window, 2 billion new connections were formed, and 600,000 job changes were recorded. That is not a survey. That is not a study of who says they got a job through a friend. That is a controlled experiment on the formation of human relationships at a scale of 20 million people, with the employment consequences measured on the other end. The results were published in the journal Science in September of 2022 by Rajkumar, St. Jacques, Bojanov, Brynjolfsson, and Arl, under a title that tells you what was at stake: a causal test of the strength of weak ties. And the finding overturns the thing almost everyone believes about their own network. The connections that most effectively transmit jobs are not your closest ones. They are also not the near strangers. The relationship between closeness and usefulness turns out to be an inverted curve. Usefulness rises as the tie gets weaker, and then, past a point, it falls again. The most valuable connection sits in the middle, and the researchers can describe that middle with uncomfortable precision. It is the person with whom you share roughly 10 connections and with whom you seldom interact. Think about who that actually is in your life. Not your best friend, not someone you have never met. It is the person you would recognize instantly, would greet warmly, and have not spoken to in a year. Why would that be the useful one? The logic, once you see it, is almost mechanical. Your closest people live inside your world. They know what you know. They hear about the same openings you hear about, from the same sources. Their information is your information, arriving slightly later. The stranger has genuinely new information, but no reason on earth to spend any of their own standing on you. The person in the middle is the only one who has both. Different information because they live somewhere you do not. Enough shared history to answer the message, and enough shared connections that recommending you costs them something if you turn out badly, which is precisely why their recommendation carries weight. Now put that finding next to a boarding school, and the whole architecture snaps into focus. What does an adolescence in a closed institution actually manufacture? It does not manufacture 10 best friends. It manufactures a standing roll of people who will always recognize your name, who share a dozen connections with you, and whom you will seldom speak to for the rest of your life. That is not an accident of the design. That is the design, generating precisely the tie strength that the largest controlled experiment ever run on the subject identifies as the most economically valuable one a person can have. The families doing this did not have the study. They had 2 centuries of watching it work, which is a slower method and, in the end, an identical one. They could not have told you about inverted curves or tie strength. They could only have told you that the boys who went there did well, and that the ones who did not, and that this had been true for as long as anyone could remember. And a stock of relationships like that has one more property, the one that decides whether a family survives a bad generation. To see it, you have to look at where these ties finally convert into money and power, and at the one place where a government has been forced to put a price on them. Everything we have looked at so far has been about entry. The school, the register, the ballot, the admissions file. All of it is machinery for getting a person inside. None of it explains where the money is. The money is in a chair, not a job, a seat on a board of directors. That is where a lifetime of accumulated relationships finally converts into something with a dollar figure attached. And it is worth understanding why that particular seat is the collection point. A board seat is not employment. You are not there every day. You are there because the people who control an institution decided that your judgment, your name, and your connections were worth having in the room where the largest decisions get made. It is the purest form of the thing we have been describing. You are paid for who you are and who you know, and the compensation is real. And here is how you know that this is not ceremonial, not a matter of honorary titles and pleasant dinners. The United States government regulates it. Section 8 of the Clayton Act prohibits interlocking directorates. In plain terms, it makes it illegal for the same person to sit on the boards of companies that compete with each other. And because that prohibition would be absurd if it applied to the corner shop, the thresholds are adjusted every single year. In January of 2026, the Federal Trade Commission announced the current figures: $54,402,000 for one provision, $5,440,200 for the other. The vote to approve them was 2-0. Stop and consider what that means. There is a number, updated annually by a federal agency, that defines the exact point at which one person sitting in 2 chairs stops being a private social arrangement and becomes a matter of antitrust law. A society does not write a law like that about something decorative. You do not pass legislation restricting who may attend which dinners. You pass it when you have concluded that the same individual, present in 2 rooms, can move markets. The law is an admission, written by the state, that the chair is power. And notice the shape of what the law can and cannot reach. It can forbid one person from occupying two specific chairs at two specific competitors above a specific dollar amount. That is the outer limit of what a rule like this can do, because it is the only part of the arrangement that is written down anywhere. It cannot touch the dinner where the two companies are discussed by people who sit on neither board. It cannot touch the recommendation that put a name in front of a nominating committee. It cannot touch the 30 years of shared history that made the recommendation credible. The statute reaches the chair, which is the visible end of the process, and the entire mechanism that produced the invitation sits comfortably outside its reach, because none of it has a form that a statute can describe. And now put the whole sequence together, because this is the architecture, end to end. A father with new money buys his son an adolescence beside the sons of old families. Those years generate a large stock of relationships of exactly the strength that transmits opportunity most effectively. The institution that housed those years also writes the document that opens the next gate, where alumni preference and a non-academic rating do work that no examination can undo. That gate triples the chance of a prestigious firm. And the firm, the graduate school, and the accumulated names eventually produce an invitation to sit in a chair that the federal government considers significant enough to regulate. At no point in that chain does anyone do anything secret. Every link is published. The school publishes its founding purpose. The Register publishes its volumes. The economists publish their findings. The Commission publishes its thresholds. The whole thing is hidden the way a load-bearing wall is hidden. It is not concealed. It is simply so structural that nobody thinks to look at it. And that brings us to the single property of this asset that explains why some families survive catastrophes that should have ended them, and why others, with far more money, simply disappear. Here's the thing about the asset we have been tracing, and it is the reason I made this video. It cannot be taken from you. Think about every other form of wealth a family can hold, and think about how each one ends. A business can fail, and in a bad decade, many of them do. Property can be mortgaged by an heir who needed liquidity and sold by the one after that. Securities fall, currencies are devalued, and when the person who built all of it dies, the estate is counted, taxed, and divided among the children, and then divided again among theirs, until the fortune that took one extraordinary life to build has been reduced to a number that no longer changes anyone's circumstances. That is the ordinary death of money, and it happens quietly, in 3 generations, to almost everyone it happens to. Now apply each of those to a network. A creditor cannot seize it. There is nothing to attach. No certificate, no account, no deed. A court can freeze every asset a family owns and cannot touch the fact that 100 people take their calls. It does not appear in an estate, so it is not taxed. There is no valuation because there is no market where it trades. And most importantly, it does not divide. This is the part that breaks the ordinary arithmetic of inheritance. If a man leaves $4 million to 4 children, each of them has $1 million. If a man leaves 4 children a place in a network, each of them has the entire network. It does not thin as it passes down. Under the right conditions, it thickens, because each child adds their own generation of ties to the stock the family already holds. Run that forward 4 generations, and the 2 curves separate so violently that they stop describing the same species of wealth. The money halves, and halves, and halves again, and at some point along that curve, it crosses the line below which it no longer changes what a person can do with their life. Meanwhile, the other asset has been compounding in the opposite direction, because every child who passes through the institutions brings back a fresh set of ties and adds them to the pile the family already holds. One is a subtraction performed once per funeral. The other is an addition performed once per childhood. An asset that cannot be seized, is not taxed, and does not divide. There is nothing else in the entire architecture of wealth that has all 3 of those properties at once. And this is why you will occasionally encounter a family whose money is visibly gone, whose houses were sold decades ago, and who are nonetheless still in every room that matters. Their capital was destroyed. Their position was not, because their position was never made of capital. The reverse case is the one that should interest you more, because it is far more common and almost nobody names it correctly. A fortune appears in a single lifetime. It is enormous, and within 2 generations, the family is not merely poorer, they are gone, socially invisible, remembered, if at all, in the name of a building. People will tell you they lost it through spending, or bad heirs, or bad luck, sometimes. But often what actually happened is simpler. They never converted. They accumulated the form of wealth that can be seized, taxed, and divided, and they never bought the form that cannot be. When the money went, there was nothing underneath it, because nothing had been built underneath it. The father in 1884 understood this, and he understood it without a single one of the studies we have discussed today. He looked at his money, and he did not see security. He saw a balance that would be halved and halved again after he was gone. So he took part of it while he still had it, and he converted it into the only thing that would still be there when the money was not. He bought his son those years in a room, and the school told him exactly what it was selling. It said so in writing. It exists, in its own words, to instill high-minded principles in the offspring of the most successful American entrepreneurs of the Gilded Age. That was never a description of an education. It was a description of a conversion.
So what do you do with this?
Not the obvious thing. The obvious thing is to conclude that you should have been born somewhere else. And that conclusion is useless to you because it was decided before you were consulted. Here is what is actually usable. First, stop measuring your relationships by warmth. Almost everyone thinking about their network thinks about the handful of people they are closest to. The research is unambiguous that this is the least productive part of your network. Not because those people do not love you, but because they know exactly what you know. Your closest circle is an echo. The value sits with the people you would greet warmly and have not spoken to in a year. And there are far more of them than you think. Second, understand that maintaining those ties costs almost nothing, which is precisely why nobody does it. A single message once a year with no request attached is the entire maintenance requirement for the most economically valuable relationship type that exists. The reason people do not send it is that it feels too small to bother with. It is not too small. It is the whole thing. Third, and this is the one that matters most, whatever you build, ask what part of it survives you. Money on its own does not. It is divided among the people you love until it stops being decisive. And that is not a failure of your children, it is arithmetic. What survives is the part that cannot be divided, and relationships are the clearest example of it that human beings have ever found. The rooms your children can walk into, the names they can use, the people who will take their call because of who you were to them. And there is a version of this you can act on at a scale you actually control. You cannot found an institution, but you can be the person who makes the introduction, and introductions are the raw material of everything we looked at today. Every proposer was once just somebody willing to attach their name to someone else's. When you put 2 people together who should know each other, and you expect nothing back, you are doing, at a small scale, the exact thing these families industrialized. Do that consistently for 20 years, and you will have built something your children can stand on, without a single volume being printed. And fourth, a caution, because this entire video has been about a machine that was built to exclude people, and I do not want to leave you admiring it. Every mechanism we examine today works by narrowing the world. The ballot that needs no reason, the register of families who arrived early, the rating that travels with a school most people cannot afford. These are not virtues. They are simply effective, and understanding an effective thing is not the same as endorsing it. The lesson is not to build a wall around your children. It is to notice that the families who lasted longest were never really guarding money. They were guarding access and passing it down deliberately in an era when everyone else was passing down cash and hoping for the best. You cannot inherit what you were never given, but you can decide, starting today, what the people after you will inherit from you. And you can decide that it will be something the world cannot take back. That is the difference between having money and having a legacy. One is counted, the other is recognized. And if you take only one image away from all of this, make it the first one. A room in 1884, 24 boys, a man of 27 at the front who would still be standing there 56 years later. Everything we spent this time examining, every register and ballot and threshold and study, is that room, repeated, refined, and defended for a century and a half. Next time, we are going to stay inside these houses and look at something stranger and much older. The families we have talked about today do not renovate their homes. They repair them endlessly at costs that make no financial sense to anyone reading a spreadsheet. And the reason why says more about how they think about time than anything else they own. If this was worth your time, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. God bless you.